Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks, and this week, the only guitar that you will ever need. No, really. This year, the Fender Telecaster celebrated its 73rd birthday, to geriatric by anyone's definition, but in spite of its bus pass and its liking for a cup of hot cocoa before bed, it doesn't really seem to be showing any signs of slowing down. It's still frequently fated as the only guitar that you will ever need. It's an epithet that I found myself parroting in the past, but is it really true? And surely an instrument that very soon will be the better part of 3/4 of a century old can't really be the pinnacle of guitar design. And if it actually is, then surely the bigger question is, where did we go wrong? It's fair to say that the Telecaster hasn't done too badly for itself, especially for a guitar that upon its grand unveiling in Summer NAMM of 1950 was mercilessly mocked by prospective dealers as a snow shovel, a canoe paddle, and perhaps most damningly, a toilet seat with strings. I think it's fair to say that Leo Fender's vision of the world's first commercially available solid body electric guitar wasn't exactly met with universal aplomb, but Leo, famously not a musician and ever the pragmatist, sought the advice of those as input that he valued most, musicians, and thus a second pickup and a steel truss rod later, the Broadcaster, soon to be renamed the Telecaster following that famous cease and desist letter from Gretsch, was unveiled to the world, making it comfortably the longest running production electric solid body guitar in existence. Much like everything that Leo Fender and George Fullerton designed, the Telecaster was geared towards being straightforward to manufacture and even easier to assemble, and in that respect, it really doesn't get any better than the Telecaster. It is simplicity personified. Literally one bit of wood bolted to another bit of wood, 6 strings, a second somewhat reluctant pickup, and 2 controls. But is that simplicity really an advantage or even a desirable feature, especially in this day and age? After all, the Stratocaster, which was introduced only a few years later, while still principally a very similar design, one bit of wood bolted to another bit of wood, would make the Telecaster look positively agricultural. And as much as I totally understand why musicians would desire the added versatility or the tonal variations of extra pickups and controls, there is really something to be said for the Telecaster's simplicity. For example, a few months back, I received a phone call from a good mate of mine, Els Bailey, asking if I could jump in at very short notice to help her out on a show after a guitar player was taken ill. Had slightly under a day to learn an entire set that I was unfamiliar with before playing it in front of around 10,000 people. It was a pretty big show. And it was only really in watching that video back of that show that it occurred to me that at no point during my preparation did it once occur to me that the guitar would be anything other than a Telecaster, which I guess for someone who doesn't typically play Tellies is somewhat notable. However, when you are in at the deep end, and quite frankly, there's enough to think about, how the songs go, if there's any songs that I start, what key the songs are in, etc., etc., there is really a hell of a lot to be said for a guitar which not only limits your options, but in some respects almost forces your hand. If you are up the creek without a canoe paddle, turns out you might just need a Telecaster. As I referenced earlier, Leo Fender was incredibly ergonomic in his design sensibilities. It's one of the reasons the Fender offered replacement necks in their catalogue. If yours wore out, or even worse, wore tired, became dirty, didn't need to worry about having it refretted. You could simply buy a replacement neck from the catalogue. And of course, an unintended byproduct of this ethos is that not only are Telecasters remarkably reliable, but there's not really much that can actually go wrong with them. And to that end, it's very rare that I've played anything approaching a bad Telecaster. Yes, of course, some are inherently better guitars than others, but there is a lot to be said for simply limiting your scope for variables in the production process. And as such, at the end, you are going to increase your chances of getting a fundamentally good guitar. They're rugged, they're generally pretty lightweight, and as the saying goes, if you're unlucky, you might have to tune yours 2 or 3 times a year. There's not much to a Telecaster, and as such, there's not really much that can go wrong, which isn't something you can say of many guitars. Les Pauls, SGs, or 335s, famously susceptible to neck breaks, whereas hollow or semi-hollow guitars are prone to feedback or damage. Even Stratocasters can be a little bit finicky to set up with their trem systems, but by comparison, a Telecaster is virtually bulletproof, and even more importantly, especially when it comes to guitarists, virtually idiot-proof. Now, of course, the oft-repeated adage of the Telecaster is that it can play anything, but not anyone can play it. The implication there being presumably that such a no-frills, stripped-back, bare-bones approach to making an instrument really does have a habit of sorting the wheat from the chaff, and as much as such a simple approach will undoubtedly deter certain musicians, the flip side of that is that, somewhat bizarrely, it does offer near unparalleled levels of versatility. While the Telecaster's country roots undoubtedly run deep and stretch all the way back to 1950 and Jimmy Bryant, the first real champion of the Telecaster, it is equally at home in the hands of jazz musicians or punks. Danny Gatton, Brad Paisley, Brent Mason, Keith Richards, Andy Summers, Bruce Springsteen, Graham Coxon, Jeff Beck, Johnny Greenwood, Albert Collins, Clarence Gatemouth Brown, Steve Cropper, Ed Bickett, Bill Frisell, Julian Lage, Joe Strummer, Jim Root, even Jimmy Page on Led Zeppelin 1. Ironically, an album which arguably sold so many on the sound of a Les Paul was, in actual fact, recorded on a Telecaster. It's of course no coincidence that so many compare the sound of those original 1958 to 1960 bursts as being a Telecaster on steroids. There is virtually nothing that you can't do on a Telecaster, and as such it does make an incredibly convincing case for really being the only guitar that you will ever actually need. And if there is something that you want from it that it can't give you, then you simply modify it. There are countless great examples of tweaked Telecasters throughout history. Of course, Keith Richards and Andy Summers with their added neck pickups, or Clarence White with his B-bender. You might have noticed the Vega tram attached to my Vintera Tele at the start of today's video. When it comes to Telecasters, such is their robustness, there is virtually nothing that you can't bolt onto them. So there you have it. The Telecaster is the perfect guitar. We peaked in 1950, and everything that's come since has been unnecessary tinkering or needlessly tweaking an already perfect design. Of course, that isn't the case. There have been any number of innovations that have proved integral to the sound of modern music, humbucking pickups and vibrato systems to name but two, but there really is still so much to be said for the simplicity of the Telecaster that speaks volumes not only of Leo's genius, but how its directness really has helped shape the sound and feel of modern music. It's the chicken and the egg. Is the Telecaster simple because we like to keep it simple? Or do we like to keep it simple because the Telecaster was simple? I like to think that it's probably the latter. As ever, I'm Chris Buck. Thank you very much for watching. This is Friday Fretworks. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe if you haven't already, and I shall see you next week for another episode. Cheers, guys. Take care. See you soon.